You've said it before. Something good happened, a job, a person, a coincidence too precise to be random, and the words came out before you could stop them. I manifested this. Or maybe it went the other way. Something fell apart, and some part of you whispered that you brought it on yourself, that your thoughts were somehow the wrong shape. You called it manifestation, or luck, or coincidence. What if it was neither? What if there isn't one law of attraction, but several, stacked on top of each other, running at the same time, most of them outside your awareness? A layer in the physics of the very small, a layer in the wiring of your own mind, a layer in the space between you and the people around you. You've only ever worked with one, and it's not the one you think. Stay with me, because 3 more are about to reveal themselves one at a time, starting with the only one science has already proven. Here's where I have to be honest with you. For a long time, I dismissed the word manifestation entirely. It sat in the same mental drawer as horoscopes and lucky numbers, a comforting story people told themselves after the fact, never a mechanism you could point to before it happened. I'd hear someone say, "I manifested my apartment," and quietly think, "No, you searched for 4 months and got lucky on a Tuesday." Then I went looking for where the idea actually came from, and the history surprised me. The phrase didn't start as an internet trend. In the 1800s, a New England clockmaker named Phineas Quimby began treating patients not with medicine, but with the claim that illness originated in mistaken belief, that changing a person's conviction about their body could change the body itself. His ideas fed into a loose current of thought that later got the name New Thought, which spent the next century mutating through self-help books, prosperity preachers, and eventually a best-selling 2006 film and book that gave it its modern, glossy packaging. The idea that your thoughts emit a kind of frequency, and the universe, obligingly, sends back more of whatever frequency you're broadcasting. None of that later packaging came from a physics lab. It came from marketing built on top of a real discovery, borrowed sideways and stretched until the original shape was unrecognizable. Here's the part that actually stopped me from dismissing it entirely, though. Underneath all of that borrowed language, there is a real evidence-based sense in which observation, attention, or expectation shapes outcome, not metaphorically, literally. I didn't want that to be true. It would have been easier to file the whole subject under nonsense and move on, but the deeper I went, the more I found a genuine mechanism sitting quietly underneath a century of exaggeration. You know this instinct, even if you've never named it. It's the reason a positive thinking book feels thin the moment life actually gets hard. It's trying to explain a multi-layered system using a single-layer story. Change your thoughts, it says, and when the outcome doesn't shift, it tells you your thoughts weren't positive enough. That's not a mechanism, that's a trapdoor, and it puts the blame back on you every single time the method fails. So let's ask the real question, the one sitting underneath all the marketing on both sides. Is there a documented sense in which observation changes outcome? Yes, but not where and not how you've been told. There is a real phenomenon, studied for over a century, in which the act of observing a system changes what that system does. It's not a metaphor borrowed by self-help writers and stretched to fit. It's the other way around. Self-help writers borrowed a real result from physics, stripped out every constraint that made it precise, and sold the leftover shape as a universal law. Something got lost in that translation, and something else, something real, got buried underneath it. That's the mini-revelation worth sitting with. The mechanism isn't fake. It's just not one mechanism. It's several, operating at completely different scales, and none of them behave the way the posters on self-help accounts claim they do. This explains why manifestation sometimes seems to work and sometimes doesn't. The same intention at different points in your life, in different rooms, with different people, produces different results. But it doesn't yet explain where in reality this effect is actually documented under laboratory conditions by people who had no interest in selling you anything. I bring up Quimby and the history not to mock it, but because you deserve to know the shape of the story you inherited before we replace it with a more accurate one. Every version of manifestation you've encountered, the vision boards, the affirmation apps, the influencer telling you to raise your frequency, descends from that same 19th century lineage. several translations removed from anything a physicist would recognize. That doesn't make the underlying instinct wrong. It makes the packaging unreliable, which is a very different problem, and one worth actually solving instead of dismissing outright. For that, we have to go back to a room with a light source and a wall. Decades before Quimby's ideas fully calcified, decades before The Secret, in a period when nobody had any commercial reason to make the results sound magical. Picture a dark laboratory room, a single source of light on one end, a barrier in the middle cut with two narrow slits, a screen on the far wall waiting to catch whatever comes through. Nobody is watching yet. The light passes through both slits at once, not as a stream of individual points but as a wave, interfering with itself the way ripples do when two stones hit a pond at the same time. The screen fills with a pattern of stripes, bands of light and dark, evidence that something wave-like happened, that the light took every possible path simultaneously and layered them on top of each other. Then someone places a detector at the slits. A simple instrument, just there to record which slit each particle actually goes through. The pattern changes, the stripes disappear. Two clean bands remain, one behind each slit, as if the light had stopped behaving like a wave and started behaving like a stream of individual bullets, each one taking a single definite path. The only thing that changed was that someone looked. This is the double-slit experiment, first performed with light by Thomas Young in 1801, and later repeated with electrons, atoms, and even large molecules throughout the 20th century. It is one of the most replicated results in the history of physics, not a rumor, not an internet exaggeration, not a story that grew in the retelling. It happens every time, under controlled conditions, in labs around the world. Here's what it actually proves, stated precisely. At the quantum scale, a system can exist in a superposition, a blend of every possible state at once, until it interacts with something that records information about which state it's in. The physicists Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, working out of Copenhagen in the 1920s, built an interpretation around exactly this, that a quantum system doesn't have a definite property until it's measured, and that measurement is what forces one outcome to collapse out of the range of possibilities. This became known as the Copenhagen interpretation, and it remains one of the dominant ways physicists talk about quantum mechanics today. Here's what it does not prove: that your thoughts, wishes, or vibes are a form of quantum measurement. That leap, the one every manifestation guru makes in the first 5 minutes, is not supported by the physics. Observation in this context means physical interaction with a measuring instrument, not conscious awareness in the human sense. A camera counts. A rock can act as a measurement if it physically interacts with a particle in a way that records information. And a rock does not think. Consciousness is not the ingredient. Physical interaction is. You've probably heard this phenomenon explained badly before, turned into proof that the universe responds to your energy. It doesn't say that. What it says is something quieter, and honestly more interesting, that at the smallest scales we can measure, reality is not fixed and singular until something forces it to resolve into one outcome. That's a claim about physics. It is not on its own a claim about your life. Keep that distinction close, because you're about to watch two more famous thought experiments make the exact same mistake look tempting. And you're going to be the one deciding each time whether the leap is earned. There's a companion thought experiment worth pausing on here, because it's the version most people have actually heard of, even if they've never heard it explained correctly. In 1935, the physicist Erwin Schrödinger proposed a scenario: a cat sealed in a box with a radioactive source rigged to release poison if a single atom decays, a 50-50 event over the course of an hour. According to the Copenhagen interpretation taken literally, until the box is opened, the atom exists in a superposition of decayed and not decayed, which means the cat, by extension, exists in a superposition of dead and alive. Schrödinger didn't propose this to endorse the idea. He proposed it as an objection, a way of showing how absurd it sounds once you scale quantum superposition up to something as large and obviously singular as a cat. That's the detail almost everyone leaves out. Schrödinger's cat isn't proof that observation creates reality at any scale you like. It's a physicist pointing at the exact place where the interpretation gets strange, specifically to ask where the boundary is between the quantum world and the one we actually live in. That boundary, as we'll get to in a moment, has a name and a real answer. So here's the question worth sitting with before we go further. If a single particle can genuinely exist in two states at once, but a cat obviously can't, where exactly does the switch flip? At what point does undetermined become definite? And does anything about that transition leave room for a wish, a thought, an intention of yours to tip the outcome? But the story doesn't end with a boundary problem, because not everyone accepted that quantum systems stay undetermined until observed. In 1935, the same year as Schrödinger's thought experiment, Albert Einstein, along with Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, published a paper, now known by their initials EPR, arguing that quantum mechanics, if taken at face value, implied something Einstein found deeply uncomfortable: that two particles once linked could remain connected in a way that made a measurement on one instantaneously correlated with the state of the other, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, and he meant it as a criticism. He suspected quantum theory was incomplete, that there had to be hidden variables we simply hadn't found yet. Decades of experiments since then, most notably those testing what are called Bell inequalities, work that earned a share of the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics, have shown that the spooky correlation is real. Einstein was right that it was strange. He was wrong that it meant the theory was broken. And there's a third piece you need because it closes the gap the gurus never mention, and it's the piece that finally answers Schrödinger's question about where the boundary sits: decoherence. This is the modern explanation for why we don't see superpositions in daily life, why your coffee cup isn't in two places at once, and why the cat was never actually going to be a real puzzle outside a sealed, idealized box. Quantum superpositions are extraordinarily fragile. The moment a quantum system interacts with its environment, with air molecules, with light, with practically anything, that interaction functions as a measurement, and the superposition collapses almost instantly. This is decoherence, and it's the reason quantum weirdness stays locked at the scale of individual particles, instead of leaking into your living room. This is the part that matters for you, specifically, so let's slow down here. Decoherence proves that at any scale larger than a handful of isolated particles, the observer effect, as physics defines it, is already happening constantly, automatically, without anyone's conscious intention involved. Your desk, your body, your bank account, all of it is already observed by its own environment thousands of times a second. That is precisely why concentrating your thoughts at a dinner table cannot collapse a wave function into a new job offer. The macroscopic world resolved that question a long time ago at the level of atoms bumping into each other, with or without your attention in the room. Notice what that actually hands you: not a loophole, but a boundary. The exact line past which attention changes outcome, stops being physics and starts being something else entirely. That something else is where we're headed next. You've probably felt this exact confusion before, even outside physics. The sense that something behaves one way when no one's checking, and differently the moment it matters. Hold on to that feeling, because it's about to show up again, at a completely different scale. There's one more version of this worth knowing, because it answers the question people usually ask next. If the information exists somewhere, does it matter whether a human ever actually looks at it? In the 1990s, physicists ran what's called a quantum eraser experiment, a refinement of the double-slit setup where which path information is recorded, but then deliberately erased before anyone checks it. When the information is recorded and available, the wave pattern disappears just as before. When that same information is erased, destroyed before any person or instrument reads it, the wave pattern reappears, even though the particles already passed through the slits. The result confirms something precise, and it matters for you specifically. It isn't the presence of a conscious mind that collapses the system. It's whether the information distinguishing one outcome from another exists anywhere, recorded, in a form that could in principle be read. Erase that record, and the system behaves as if the measurement never happened at all. This closes the door one more time on the idea that your personal awareness is the magic ingredient. The ingredient is recorded information, full stop. A distinction most manifestation content never makes, because the distinction is inconvenient for the story being sold. So the paradox from Block 1 gets its first validation and its first correction. Yes, there is a real documented phenomenon in which the act of interaction determines what a system becomes. No, it is not the mechanism behind wishing for a parking space. The physics is real. The popular application of the physics is a category error, one layer mistaken for another, which raises the actual question worth asking. If measurement genuinely does shape outcome at the smallest scale, and it does, is there an equivalent process at the scale of a human life? Not the same mechanism, borrowed and stretched. A parallel one. Something that behaves, structurally, the way quantum measurement behaves, without requiring physics to explain human choice. There is. And it starts inside you, with something you do every day without noticing it. You measure yourself constantly through the simple act of where you place your attention. Here's the first real level of manifestation, and it has nothing to do with particles. You are not one continuous, unified you. Internal family systems, a framework developed by the therapist Richard Schwartz, describes the mind as a system of distinct internal parts, not a metaphor for personality quirks, but a working model in which different parts of you carry different fears, different desires, different strategies, often in direct conflict with each other. One part wants the promotion. Another part is terrified of the visibility that comes with it. One part wants the relationship. Another part is quietly convinced it will end the way the last one did, and is already bracing for the exit. This matters because of what happens next. Attention, in your internal system, functions the way a measuring instrument functions in a quantum lab. It doesn't create the parts. They're already there, like the light already traveling through both slits. But attention is what collapses the range of possible responses into an actual, lived outcome. Whichever part receives the most repeated, emotionally charged attention is the one that ends up measuring your behavior, regardless of which part you'd consciously choose if you were asked to pick. This is why people manifest the opposite of what they say they want, and it isn't mystical. Not a curse, a pattern. Say a person wants a stable relationship out loud, sincerely. But the part of them that fears abandonment gets far more attention, minute to minute, than the part that wants closeness, because fear is louder, and louder tends to win the room. That fear part isn't a background hum. It's active, scanning for the exit before the relationship has even started, testing the other person, interpreting a late reply as evidence rather than as a late reply. The stated intention was closeness. The part running the internal measurement over and over was fear. And fear, measured most often, is what collapses into the actual lived pattern. Distance, sabotage, and ending that arrives right on schedule. You do this, everyone does this. The question was never whether you have conflicting internal parts. You do, everyone does. The question is which one you've been unconsciously feeding with your attention. It shows up just as precisely outside relationships. Take someone who says they want to leave a job that's draining them. On the surface, one part of them is already drafting the resignation. But underneath there's a part carrying an old belief, maybe inherited from a parent who lost work during a hard year, that says stability is the only thing standing between you and disaster. That part doesn't announce itself, it just quietly runs the numbers every time an opportunity appears and finds a reason each one isn't quite safe enough yet. The stated intention is change. The measured part is fear of instability. A year later, nothing has moved, and the person tells themselves they just haven't manifested it yet. When the truth is simpler and less mystical, the part getting fed the most attention was never the part that wanted to leave. The psychologist Daniel Wegner documented a closely related trap in what he called ironic process theory. The harder you try not to think about something, the more that exact thought intrudes, because monitoring for its absence requires holding the thought in mind to check. Tell someone not to think about a white bear, and the bear shows up more, not less. This is why just don't focus on your fear of failure backfires as advice. The instruction itself keeps the fear in the measuring position, checked and rechecked, fed by the very effort meant to suppress it. You, right now, are almost certainly running at least one process like this, a stated goal in the front of your mind, and a quieter, more frequently measured part underneath it doing the actual collapsing. That's not a character flaw. It's how a multi-part system with limited conscious access always works, in everyone, including the version of me writing this to you. There's a related idea from emotion research worth adding here, because it explains why simply trying to feel differently so rarely works as a fix. The psychologist James Gross has spent decades studying the difference between reappraisal, changing how you interpret a situation before the emotion fully forms, and suppression, which is trying to push an emotion down after it's already arrived. Gross's research consistently finds that suppression takes measurable cognitive effort, often backfires by making the suppressed emotion more salient to the person doing the suppressing, and does nothing to reduce how intensely other people can still read it on your face. Reappraisal done earlier actually works. Suppression done later mostly just spends energy hiding a measurement that's already been taken. Translate that back to attention. Telling a frightened part of yourself to be quiet after it's already been measuring your behavior for years is suppression. It costs you effort, it doesn't remove the part's influence, and it doesn't change which part is collapsing your outcomes. The actual lever was always earlier, noticing which part gets fed before the pattern sets, not silencing it after the fact. Here's the mini payoff, and it comes with a cost. This solves the mystery of why positive thinking so often fails to change outcomes. You can say a bright sentence once at the surface, while a frightened part underneath repeats its own sentence 100 times, unheard. But it creates a bigger problem than the one it solves. You can't out-argue a part you don't know you have. You can't redirect attention you're not aware you're spending. The mechanism is real, but it operates below the level where willpower has any grip at all. So the level 1 form of manifestation isn't wishing. It's noticing, with something close to forensic precision, where your attention actually goes when nobody's checking. Not what you say you want, what you keep measuring. And here's where it gets larger than your own head, because attention doesn't stay contained inside you. It leaks outward. It shapes the people around you, whether you intend it to or not, which means there's a second level of manifestation happening in every relationship you're part of right now, and almost nobody knows it's running. This is the level almost nobody talks about, because it isn't about you at all. It's about what your expectations do to other people, measurably, without a single word exchanged. In 1968, the psychologists Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson ran a study in an elementary school that has since become one of the most cited findings in social psychology. Teachers were told that certain students, chosen in reality completely at random, had been identified through testing as intellectual bloomers, on the verge of a significant leap in academic performance. The teachers weren't told to treat these students differently. They weren't given a script. They were simply told an expectation. By the end of the year, those randomly selected students showed measurably greater gains in academic performance than their classmates. Nothing about the students had actually changed at the start. What changed was the belief circulating in the room around them, and that belief altered how the teachers behaved. More eye contact, more patience with wrong answers, more subtle warmth, delivered in increments too small for anyone involved to consciously notice. This became known as the Pygmalion effect, and it has been replicated in various forms across classrooms, workplaces, and even laboratory settings with animals. One striking early version found that lab technicians who believed their rats were bred for intelligence got faster maze learning results from perfectly ordinary rats, simply by handling them with more patience and confidence. What it proves: expectation changes behavior, the expector's behavior, in ways precise enough to alter outcomes in someone else, without any explicit communication of the expectation itself. What it does not prove: that simply believing hard enough at a person can rewrite events unconnected to human behavior. The mechanism runs entirely through interaction. Change the behavior of the person doing the expecting, and you change the response you get back. Remove the interaction, and the effect has nothing left to travel through. You do this constantly in every direction. You walk into a room already believing a colleague is difficult, and your body arrives slightly braced before a word is spoken, arms a little more closed, tone a little more clipped. And the colleague, reading signals faster than either of you can consciously track, responds to the bracing, not to whatever you actually intended. The expectation manifested, not through magic, through posture. This same mechanism runs at scale, not just one-on-one. Negotiation researchers Roger Fisher and William Ury, in their influential work on principled negotiation, describe how a negotiator's private expectation of the outcome, their sense of their own BATNA, their best alternative to a negotiated agreement, visibly changes their tone, their pacing, even their willingness to sit in silence long before any number is stated out loud. Two negotiators can walk into the identical room with identical facts, and the one who has quietly decided the deal is likely to work will negotiate differently, more open, less defensive, than the one who has quietly decided it's likely to fail. The outside circumstances are the same. The manifested outcome, more often than either side would like to admit, tracks the internal expectation walking in the door. The workplace version of this is easy to spot once you're looking for it. A new manager inherits a team and privately decides, within the first week, which employees are the strong ones and which are the ones who need managing. No memo goes out, but the strong ones start getting the ambiguous high-visibility projects. The manager's expectation reads as trust, delivered through small acts of delegation, while the others get closely scoped, closely supervised work, which reads to them, correctly, as a lack of confidence. A year later, the gap in performance between the two groups is real and measurable. It was manifested, not because the manager had strange powers, but because expectation is never actually private. It leaks through every assignment, every glance, every meeting where one person's idea gets built on and another's gets quietly dropped. This is level 2 then, manifestation as a relational feedback loop, running through micro-expression, tone and timing, invisible to the people inside it while it's happening. But what happens when the thing you're measuring isn't a person in front of you, but something that already happened and can't be undone? There's a body of research, led by the psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, on what they termed post-traumatic growth, documented positive psychological change that some people report following a genuinely severe life disruption, illness, loss, disaster, the kind of event nobody would choose. This is not the same claim as everything happens for a reason, and Tedeschi and Calhoun have been careful to say so directly. The research does not claim the traumatic event itself was good or necessary or secretly a gift. It documents something narrower and more precise, that in the aftermath, some people actively reconstruct their sense of meaning, priorities, and identity in ways that leave them, by their own report, changed for the better in specific, measurable domains. Closer relationships, a clearer sense of purpose, a recalibrated relationship to what actually matters. Consider what this actually looks like in practice, stripped of the abstraction. Someone loses a job they'd built an entire identity around. For months, there's nothing to measure but the loss itself. The mind keeps returning to the same collapsed outcome over and over, the way a tongue keeps checking a missing tooth. Post-traumatic growth research suggests the shift doesn't come from forcing positivity onto that loss. It comes gradually, from where attention gets redirected once the initial shock passes, toward what the disruption exposed that had been true all along and simply unexamined. A set of priorities that no longer made sense, a relationship that had gone quiet and deserved more attention, a version of competence that was never actually tied to the job title in the first place. The event isn't reframed as good. The self doing the noticing is rebuilt around what the event revealed. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, writing nearly 2,000 years before Tedeschi and Calhoun ran a single study, described something close to the same mechanism using a simpler distinction: the dichotomy of control. Some things are within your power, your judgments, your responses, where you direct your attention. Everything else strictly is not. Epictetus wasn't offering comfort. He was offering a measurement instruction. Stop spending attention relitigating what already collapsed, and start spending it on the only variable that was ever within reach. That instruction, it turns out, is close to a working definition of what post-traumatic growth actually requires in practice. Here's the level 3 mechanism, and it's the deepest one in the entire chain. Manifestation, at this scale, isn't wishing a different past into existence. It's the active reconstruction of meaning after a reality has already, irreversibly, collapsed into one outcome you didn't choose. The event isn't undone. The self that interprets the event is rebuilt. And that reconstruction is not passive. It's a repeated act of attention, applied over months and years toward what the disruption made possible instead of only what it destroyed. Whitchurch, Wilson, and Gilbert, publishing in the journal Psychological Science, ran a study on this exact blind spot with romantic attraction. Participants were shown profiles of people who had supposedly rated them, some clearly liked them, some clearly didn't, and a third group's